Bonjour. Bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. Bonjour et bienvenue tout quelqu'un. Welcome to the second edition of our series Entre, Nous. I am Tiffany Guillory Thomas, and I will be your host for the discussion this afternoon. I'd like to thank Nous Foundation, its founders and board, for this opportunity and for the platform to have such meaningful discussions about Louisiana, about its history, and about its place in the world. The month of October has been designated International Creole Heritage Month. And we see people from all over the world, especially with social media, celebrating Creole-ness, history, accomplishments, etc. At the same time, questions arise about Creole-ness in America. What is Creole? What does that word mean? Why is there a distinction? And what do we have to learn from Creole people here in America? Today, we will discuss that, and as we uncover the influence of Creole culture on America. We are honored to have distinguished professor and author, Dr. Angel Adams Parham, joining us from Virginia. Dr. Parham's research is in the historical and comparative historical sociology of race. She is the author of the award-winning book, American Roots, Racial Palimpsests, and the Transformation of Race, which examines changes in race and racialization in New Orleans under the French, Spanish, and Anglo-American administrations. Thank you so much, Dr. Parham, for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself even further for us?
Well, it's such a pleasure, Tiffany, to be here. So thank you to you and the Nous Foundation for the invitation. I think you've done a marvelous job. So I guess I would just add that I am in Virginia now, but that is pretty new. It's only been about 2 months. So I spent 18 years in New Orleans, and that has been, where I have established all of the work that I've been doing and what I will be speaking with you about today.
Wow, 18 years.
Yes.
Yes, and so that kind of leads me into my next question. As a distinguished sociologist, your research covers the connections between race and national belonging in the United States. How did you get involved in studying Creole culture in the Gulf South?
Great question. And, very interesting story. So before I moved to New Orleans, almost 20 years ago, I had been doing my work on Haitian immigrants. So I wrote my dissertation on Haitian immigrants, since maybe like the 1960s post Duvalier. So that brought me to New Orleans, and I had been very interested in Haitians and Haitian culture and visiting Haiti. And then when I got to New Orleans, the chair of my department at the time said, there's a long historical connection between New Orleans and Haiti. And I said, oh, really? Hadn't thought about it. And you would think that someone who has done their PhD would already know this history, because it's such a significant one. Mm-hmm. But I hadn't really come across it. I hadn't really thought about it. And so when I heard that, I said, well, let me look into this. Let's see what's going on. And the work that I've been doing amongst more recent Haitian immigrants and Haitian Americans, part of my dissertation research had taken me in the direction of looking at writers who were doing kind of Creole cultural work, so writing in Creole and like really talking about the importance of taking Creole as a language very seriously on par with other languages. And so I'd learned to read and speak Haitian Creole before I came. And so when I heard about that, I decided to see what was going on in Louisiana. And I had been doing some work with online groups that were doing work on Haitian Creole and writing in Creole. And so I decided, well, let's see what's going on amongst Louisiana Creoles online. And that was my first entree, was going online and basically, kind of seeing what were people talking about in Creole, Louisiana. And so I found really interesting conversation about identity and, what it meant to be Creole, especially amongst Creoles of color, uh,
Mhm.
some of their many struggles vis-a-vis Anglo-identified African Americans who were not Creole, often a sense of frustration, and it was very interesting to me. And then I also found conversations about Creole, Louisiana Creole as a language, and people trying to learn it, which reminded me some of the conversation I'd seen in Haitian Creole. Not that people are trying to learn Haitian Creole because it's much more spoken, it is the national language of Haiti, but just this sense of really, the respect that is due or should be due the language that they were not experiencing. So that was my very first entree to learning more about Louisiana Creoles. And it was pretty much off and running from there.
Wow. Thank you so much. And so you're talking about Haiti. So there's the Caribbean. So help remind our audience about how maybe the idea of Creole was formed in the Caribbean. And how does that idea get to Louisiana?
Sure, sure. So, I mean, the idea of Creole is something that has been throughout the hemisphere of the Americas. So it's not unique to Louisiana. It's not unique to the Caribbean. The initial idea or understanding of Creole was born in the Americas. And, it wasn't only people even, that you could have Creole tomatoes, Creole animals of various sorts, but the idea is that it's in the Americas. So it was from the parents were from the old world, but the children are born in the Americas. So initially that was the idea, and the distinction was made in the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas in Louisiana under the French between people who were originally from France and those who were Creoles, who were American born, who were what we would categorize today as white. They made distinctions between enslaved people, whether they were Creole, that is born in the Americas, or whether they had been born in Africa and brought here. So that distinction was already in Louisiana. It wasn't necessarily brought from the Caribbean, but there are ties and ties to the Caribbean in terms of this was a widespread practice or a widespread understanding. The term was not so much used amongst Anglo-Americans as it was amongst the French and the Spanish.
Oh, really? So that's not a term that Anglo-Americans would have used, but more of a term that French and Spanish?
It's not one that I have seen used
Mhm.
so much historically by Anglo-Americans. It came to be seen as a distinction amongst Anglo-Americans in interacting with the French and the Spanish. And certainly the similar concept would have been there.
Mhm.
But that Creole designation as an identity marker is something that has been more prevalent mainly in the Caribbean and in Latin America.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for that clarification. And Louisiana Creole communities are often presented as the proverbial other in American history. Why do you think these communities are often researched and kind of put in their own little bubble, separate from the rest of American history?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think this has to do with the fact that the United States is now profoundly Anglo-American, right? And so it's the English history and heritage that we are heir to. It is Anglo-American approaches to race as well as culture that have become dominant. And so when people come into contact with a very different history and culture that still marks Louisiana and New Orleans in particular, and certainly Lafayette, where you are based,
Mhm.
then it seems like this kind of alien culture to many people. Even though, certainly that culture was here even when we were not under the Anglo-Americans. So it was not until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 that Louisiana was brought into the rest of the United States, which was largely Anglo-American. And so over the years, you will see various writers, who come to visit New Orleans who will exoticize New Orleans, exoticize Louisiana, and say, it's like the Caribbean, it's the most, un-American place I've been. So you get this reinforcement with many travel writers, many visitors saying, this is a place apart, this is completely different. And I think part of it is because indeed under the French and then the Spanish, it was different linguistically, it was different in terms of the predominance of Catholics, as opposed to
Mhm.
Protestants in Anglo-America. It was different in terms of race and the practice of race, which you still see some of the vestiges of that with Creoles of color. So for your typical Anglo-American, all of this looks very alien. All of this seems like it's just not American. And so we've gotten that kind of reputation for being different, for being exoticized. And it continues today. If you think about the marketing for tourism for Louisiana, it's this kind of mystical, separate place and culture. So it's just been continued.
Ah, yes. So from that conversation, it's reminding me of this word that you use in your book, and it's called a palimpsest. And
Mhm.
so, and since we're talking about uncovering the Creole influence on America, could you please explain what a palimpsest is?
Yes, yes, yes. So a palimpsest, I don't recall when I first was introduced to this word, but it's stuck in my mind ever since. So it's probably easiest to think of a physical palimpsest first, like say a painting.
Mhm.
Um, we've probably all seen a painting where you can just discern that there is some other layer beneath the top layer. The artist may have done that on purpose, or it may be that a previous painting has been uncovered. And so you see a strong top layer, but you can still see the vestiges of the previous layer underneath it. That is a palimpsest. So with a palimpsest, it is intrinsically about layering, but the top layer does not fully cover the submerged layer. And that's really key in a palimpsest. It's not just one layer on top of another. It's the fact that you can see something of the previous layer or layers. For those of us who do archival work, you'll also see this in old documents sometimes, that you can see that there is a stronger writing on top of more faint writing on the bottom. That would also be a palimpsest. So the way that I use that term in my book, American Roots, is racially, that New Orleans in particular is a racial palimpsest because it was under the French and the Spanish and then the Anglo-Americans. Each of those colonial regimes put their own kind of racial administration over the next one. And the most strikingly different was the Anglo-American racial regime, which consisted of largely Black and white and didn't have that same intermediate institutional space for free people of color. But you can still see the vestiges of those earlier influences of the French and the Spanish, even today, in many parts of Louisiana, where you do have a significant Creole population. And in speaking with Louisiana Creoles, this comes up over and over again, and that's what I was seeing in some of that early online discussion is many Creoles of color just thinking about growing up in the United States, feeling like they don't quite belong, that they're not quite, the same as Anglo-Black Americans, but they're not white. They're kind of in this other in-between group that nobody seems to recognize other than themselves. And so that's, so they are actually embodying this idea of the palimpsest, is that their identity and their way of thinking about and moving in the world is still kind of a holdover from the French and the Spanish periods, where there was a triracial system, but they're living and growing up in an Anglo-American world that has historically only really recognized two categories of Black and white.
Wow. So a three-tiered system of
Right.
racial identity. Could you explain that again?
Yes. So within Louisiana, under the French and the Spanish, particularly under the Spanish, so everywhere, I should say first that everywhere there were free people of color. Even in Anglo-American states and territories, there were free people of color. But Anglo-Americans did not feel comfortable with that kind of in-between group. And they made it very difficult for free people of color to flourish. And there was no kind of defined institutional space for them. So when I say defined institutional space, for example, in colonial Saint-Domingue, there was a kind of informal practice that was often called plaçage. And this was a situation where a woman of color, often a free woman of color, sometimes a woman who was still enslaved, had a partnership with a white man. And even though it was informal, it was still an institution in the sense of it being recognized widely within that society. You had similar kinds of relationships in Louisiana as well, under the French and the Spanish. And again, a situation where there is kind of widespread understanding of that as a practice, and where the fathers were more likely than their Anglo-American counterparts to recognize those children publicly, to educate them, even send them to France to get an education. So whereas with Anglo-Americans, it was often very hush-hush and very little interest in public recognition, in these other societies, French and Spanish, more likely to be recognized. The Catholic Church was also a vehicle for this, where white relatives might stand in as godparents for children of color. So there were these ways of socially recognizing on a large scale this in-between group of people, through recognizing the couples, through recognizing the children, and so on and so forth. So there's a very different attitude toward interactions across color, and a less rigid sense of race, where with the Anglo-Americans, it's just Black and white.
Okay. And you had mentioned that the Afro Creoles, or Creoles of African descent, sometimes that would cause friction between maybe Afro-Americans. Is that something that you're seeing? Is that something that any of the testimonials that you've researched and people have told you? Is that anything that you've seen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Very, very common. I remember when I first started doing this work, and when I would tell some African Americans who had no Creole ancestry what I was doing, I would get these kind of visceral negative reactions. Like, oh, those are the people who just think they're not Black. And it was like, even down to facial expressions, like just very negative, very negative. And I'm sure that comes out of a very different lived experience than I've had. So I've heard some African Americans in Louisiana who've grown up there, just say that they were made to feel like they were inferior, that they were made to feel like their color was a problem, because they were darker than many Louisiana Creoles. And so it was a very, very negative response when I started the research. And then conversely, when I would speak with Creoles in some of my interviews, they would also, they had had a very hard time. They had been accused of, not liking their African ancestry, of trying to not be Black, trying to be white, and just kind of on each side, this sense of angst and, kind of antagonism. And so when I came in, I had none of that background. And so I just wanted to listen. I had no axe to grind. I was not trying to accuse anybody of being anything or not being legitimate. I just wanted to understand. And so I was very open to just hear people's stories. And, it was really, really fascinating. And I'm really grateful to the people who shared their stories with me.
Wow, I'm grateful. We are very grateful for the research that you've done. And I think that's a wonderful point. I just want to hear the people's stories.
Yes.
And with no preconceptions, you just want to hear
That's right.
the lived experience,
Exactly.
the human experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's such a rich experience,
Yes, it is.
And, basically what I found is that, sure, there are some Creoles who have presented themselves as being better than, their culture and history being better than. There have been some, but I wouldn't say that's been the dominant experience that I've had. I would say the dominant experience when I was moving in those circles was welcome. We're glad you're here. We'd love to share our history and culture with you. I had no sense of anyone looking down on me, or not at all. So I think it's just to say that there are people in every group who are disagreeable,
Right.
right? But I did not find that to be the defining characteristic of Creoles at all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a great way to go into this next question, because I was hearing some of the words of Dedun in my mind as you were talking. Yeah. Building on our last discussion with Marc Rudenet, that's who the last guest for Entre, Nous was, whose great-great-grandfather had founded the Black Creole newspaper, La Tribune, to advocate for civil rights. What have you found to be important in better understanding the fight for civil rights in the 1860s through Reconstruction? Was there an impact on the future of the civil rights movement of the 1960s? And how could we link that civil rights movement to the idea of being Creole? And what do Creole people have to do with all of that?
Right. That's a wonderful question. And so this is interesting. I have not in my research necessarily come across civil rights movement participants and pioneers in the 1950s and 60s who were self-consciously invoking the civil rights movement of the 1860s and the 1890s. Doesn't mean they weren't out there. I may just have not come across them yet. But it seems to me that it would be correct to say that that's not a dominant understanding. Like if you were to ask your typical person, about their understanding of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, their go-to is not going to be, oh yes, and we built on the lessons of Louisiana in the 1860s and 1890s. I think I'm pretty safe in saying that your typical American is not going to say that that's the case. However, the parallels are stunning.
Yes.
Are stunning. You go to the Plessy case in the 1890s, right? That is the same strategy as with Rosa Parks, and trying to challenge segregation in transport, right? Very similar parallel strategies of finding just the right person to test out the law and to break the law, right? The Plessy case did not end in our favor. The civil rights movement finally did end in our favor with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. But, very, very similar struggles and strategies. Now, the 1860s with Dedun and Rudenet and that group, well, Dedun was writing about it in the 1890s. And then Rudine is pioneering it with his paper. So that one is very significant because you get this group of Creoles of color who are advocating on behalf of all people of African descent. Now, I will say that there was a debate amongst them and in the paper about how they should approach this. That is, should we fight on behalf of all people of African descent? Should we fight mainly for ourselves, who have many of us have been free for generations? You know, what framing should we do on this? But after some initial debate, they did settle in on, no, we really have to fight for all of us, for all people of African descent, enslaved and free. And that was a really crucial decision there. And I think a really important one for thinking politically in terms of, you know, what is the best kind of political strategy, but one that also recognizes that there is diversity in Blackness. There is diversity in Blackness, right? And often I think once we move into a fully anglicized narrative of who we are as a country and as Black people in this country, we sometimes lose that sense of the diversity. And there's this idea that to be quote unquote Black, like there's this one kind of essential, you know, authentic way somehow of being Black, you know, which is part of how you get these tensions between Creoles and African Americans who are not Creole of, you know, the accusations of you're not Black or you're trying not to be Black. What does that mean? There are diverse ways of inhabiting Blackness, right? And Creole can be one of those. Now, there are some Creoles I spoke with who wanted nothing to do with a Black identity. Okay, that's their choice, but that's not everyone. There are plenty of other Creoles who see themselves as being Creole and Black, and they don't see a conflict between them. But I think part of what we can get out of those struggles is that was a very early example of diversity and Blackness and working together to advance our interest, you know, rather than tearing each other apart. But it really breaks my heart that we don't understand those earlier civil rights movements and that that's not taught. And I think that's a real problem because those are resources, social and political and historical resources that we all need in order to better understand what it means to be American and what it means to push forward the struggle for rights and equity.
Yes, we are missing that story. So give us a few, just a few things that we would be better off by pulling from the 1860s and 1890s from the movement that was happening then. What are we missing? Just give us an idea of what we're missing.
So I think what we're missing is historical depth. When we're looking mainly or only to the 20th century and the mid 20th century at that, we don't really understand how deep the history of Black mobilization and Black erudition are, that these were incredibly highly educated people. They were erudite, they were culturally sophisticated, they were politically astute. And when we don't draw on that history, all of us who identify as Black in some way, that is our history too. We may not all be Creole, but the struggle that they were fighting was against racial forces that were oppressive to all of us. And yet there are many amongst them who did so many praiseworthy things, who were so well educated. And I think to really see that is part of our heritage, all of us, you know, that all of us didn't get that kind of education and some of us are still struggling for it. But I think to be able to look back and see that, for instance, to see what the poets of Les Sonnets did with their publication in 1845, that's very important. Yes, it was in French, but that doesn't mean that it's not significant for all of us to see what people of African descent were able to contribute and to do when they had some resources, even not a lot of resources, but a few resources, so just thinking about what we can do now with all the resources that we have to take education seriously, to take political mobilization seriously, and that, it wasn't just so recently in the civil rights movement that happened. I think the other thing too is, so we think about the protests of 2020 last year,
Mhm.
and Black Lives Matter and so on, that I think it's very important for us as we engage and struggle over time to be able to see historically who some of our foremothers and forefathers were, and to understand that this is not, it's not the beginning of the struggle. Everything in the struggle is not unique, but to draw on and to also be encouraged by some of the victories. Sometimes it can sound almost like in these struggles, oh, we've made no ground, whatever. We haven't made any progress. We're still being beat down by the system.
Mhm.
Yes, there is still virulent and violent racism, absolutely. But that doesn't mean there's been no progress. And so I think looking back at that history, not just to the 1950s and 60s, but going back 100 years earlier,
Mhm.
to see, yes, there has been progress. Yes, there have been other times like this when we've struggled, but we have in the long term been making progress. I think that's important just in terms of sustenance for the soul, that it's not the case that nothing has changed. It's still depressing the extent to which we have work ahead of us, but it's very important for the health of our soul
Mhm.
to know that we've had people in our community mobilized, fighting, smart, and brave for generations.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for that encouragement. And that's what we should think on.
Mhm.
And the way that you brought out how educated people were and how well thought out the political mobilization was. And then also that they're doing this in French, in English, all of that together. And so we have those people to look back on. We have those victories to look back on, and we should, and it should be open for us to see, not covered.
That's right. The other thing I'd add in terms of education that's so important, I think,
Mhm.
is there have been some recent debates. One of the skirmishes recently has been over getting rid of or criticizing the classics, saying that, oh, this is only for white people. Well, I beg to differ. There's a very long Black intellectual tradition of folks who were classically educated, and they weren't just being assimilationists. They weren't just mimicking white and European writers at all. They were reading these classic texts and writing their own classic text out of that. It's just a matter of being rooted in a tradition. And there's no reason for us to cut ourselves off from that tradition. Part of that tradition, many of us, again, who are identified as being of African descent, we can enter into that classic tradition through Black intellectuals like Deydun,
Hmm.
through Black intellectuals like the poets of Les Senel, through the kinds of wonderful writers who are chronicled in Clint Bruce's recent brilliant book
Mhm.
of translating the poetry from those 1860s papers, where you see how richly rooted they are in this tradition of great writings, but then they create their own great writings in dialogue with them, critically assessing those writings and creating their own. So I would say this sense of education, this importance of education, is so critically important for Black people today. We need the whole heritage, right?
That's right.
So read these great Black intellectuals and look at who they're citing. You will see that they are citing all kinds of classic and canonical writers, and then they are in critical dialogue with them, and then they're writing their own great text. And that's the kind of emulation. And they use those writings with their promise of liberty and
Mhm.
equality. They use those writings to claim those rights. that is a tradition that we need again today. Black people need that today,
Yes.
right? This is not, something extra or on the side or for elites. You want to know where your rights come from, what your tradition is. You need to go back to those Black intellectuals and then go back to the writings that they're citing and wrestle with that yourself.
That's right. Thank you so much for that insight. And speaking of Dr. Clint Bruce's book, you wrote the foreword for that book, am I right?
Yes.
Yes. And then I've also seen you talk on the Black intellectual tradition and classical education.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes, it's a great passion of mine, because I think we cheat ourselves by not knowing that tradition.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'll have, I think I have time for one more question, and then we're going to go into the Q&A. And to take a closer look today, what do you see as the continued impact of Creole culture and the term itself on Louisiana and the United States more broadly? How has this term changed with the arrival of new communities from the broader Caribbean sphere? So I know in the United States, we're looking at immigration. Mm-hmm. What does this Creole history, what does it have to say to that?
It has quite a lot to say to that, actually. Mm-hmm. And so this was one of the insights that I gleaned as I was working on my book, which is that the situation of Creoles in Louisiana and the migration that occurred there, particularly after the revolution in Saint-Domingue, where you had a large number of not only enslaved Black people, but also free people of color streaming into Louisiana and particularly into New Orleans. What I realized is that we had essentially a historical case study that very much mirrors what we're dealing with today, with large numbers of immigrants of color, many of them from Latin America and the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. Miami is a very good example of this, and Miami is where I grew up. So I got to see some of this transformation over time. I saw and heard the tensions, the resentments of, again, say Black Americans compared to West Indians. West Indians think they're better than us. It's like the same conversation happening now again. And the same sense of making separations. And sure enough, there were people from the West Indies who distanced themselves from African Americans, don't want to be considered part of them because we've been stigmatized. That also is similar to what has been experienced in Louisiana. It is a matter of drawing on that history and that kind of case to see we don't need to fight against each other, that it's much better for us to work together and to understand that there is a diversity of Black experiences. The other kind of similarity is that idea of the creation of a racial palimpsest, of two different racial systems operating in the same space. You also see that in Miami, where the Anglo-American racial system is foundational, but then you've got all of these immigrants who are bringing in completely different understandings of race and color and operating in a very different way. And so again, we can look back to see what happened in Louisiana. What did we do well? What did we not do well? What are some of the pitfalls? How can we understand better how to live together with that kind of diversity? So it's really a historical and cultural case that deserves much more attention.
Yes, it does. And I think that's very interesting, as you were pointing out in Miami, how it's the other way around. We have like an Anglo-Saxon on culture on the bottom, and then on top with the immigration. That's and right. Then they come with a different sense of a racial identity, a different culture to them, right. A different culture. And people don't know what to do sometimes. And we can look back to these former waves of immigration to be informed.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. We're just about at the end of my questions, but I can see that there are questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to take a look at those and get those to you. Let's see. Okay, we have a question here from Mark Rudine. Hi there, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Some Blacks loathe the word Creole because it can be perceived as slightly less Black. Others identifying as Creole do not see it as a rejection of Blackness or as an exclusion. What are your thoughts on the old colorism tensions between Blacks descended from enslaved ancestors and Creoles descended from free people of color? To what extent do you see those tensions still existing today?
They are still there, my friend. they are still there. Yeah. And it's very unfortunate that they're still there. And I think it just shows that we still have a ways to go. And this is why, when I started my research and I started talking to people, I was getting these very negative visceral reactions. And I think what it takes is spaces where we can have conversations so that people can really learn from each other. And so that they can see this doesn't have to be antagonistic. And also, I think, partly there's a need to recover some of that lost history. Not that the history shows things were just wonderful at all, but to recover some of that history, to see what the contributions have been with different groups of people of African descent, how we've all made various contributions in moving forward. And so I think looking at that history, really appreciating some of the differences in culture and, liking those differences rather than, kind of condemning them is very important. But how do we do that? What are the spaces? I think that's part of the question. I think we have to start with people who are open. If you do have people who are just hardened and they just don't want to hear it. You have to start where there are people who are open. There are people who are open who are African American and who are not Creole, and there are people who are open who are Creoles of color of African descent. And you start with those folks, bringing them together, and then they can try to work on others, in their friends and family circle, to try to deal with some of that. But the issue of colorism is still working not only just between Creole and non-Creole people of African descent, but within the Creole community itself. And this is one of the most heartbreaking things I saw in my interviews, where people who had darker skin, who looked maybe more like me, were being made to feel in their own Creole families that, well, I guess you're all right, because you have our name, but it almost felt like this kind of second-class citizen within their own family.
Right.
So that clearly is problematic. And so I think that, there are issues that need to be dealt with amongst Creoles themselves. And then there are issues that need to be dealt with between Creole and non-Creole African Americans.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I like the way that you pointed out for people to be open, to start with the people that are open. And it's going to take courage.
Right.
It takes the bravery to talk about these things.
It does.
And an open heart. But we're doing it but we do this, like we're having this discussion.
That's right.
For the betterment of everyone.
We hope so.
Yes. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to ask another question here. Okay, from Michelle. How did this layering of a binary, racial caste, and English law and customs influence how Creoles of color conceptualized Blackness during the Americanization of New Orleans, if at all?
Yes. Good question. It certainly did, very significantly, particularly in the late 19th century. So you still had, kind of questions about between Creoles and non-Creole African Americans. How do we work together? Do we work together? Where do we have common ground? But things really get difficult post-Reconstruction. So post-Reconstruction, with the kind of the return, the raging return of very overt white supremacy, not that it ever left, but it just became, it was braver. Post-Reconstruction, you are well into the 19th century. And so you don't have that same kind of refreshment of people coming in from colonial Saint-Domingue, from Haiti, from other parts of the Caribbean, who might stave off some of this, kind of very rigid black-white categorization. So it's very solidly Anglo-American. And in that situation, you really had to be Black or white. And this is also part of the time when Creoles of color were put in this pretty impossible situation, right? So that third space had shrunk, and you have this very kind of rabid white supremacy. And so you're in this situation of, okay, do I stay here and deal with this? Maybe I pass as white so that I am not so persecuted. You had a diaspora leave and go out west to escape the persecution.
That's right.
Some of them passed as white, some of them stayed as people of color. In New Orleans and Louisiana itself, some passed as white, some stayed as people of color. But it ripped families apart, right? This impossible choice that no one should have had to make. How do I take care of myself and my family under this kind of persecution? And for some, it meant becoming white. So that, dealing with that kind of very rigid racial categorization amongst the Anglo-Americans made a huge difference, particularly post-Reconstruction. And it had, it was also during this time, during Reconstruction and after, that white Creoles also had to make this big choice, because the understanding of Anglo-Americans was that to be Creole in any way was to be racially mixed. And so even if you were a white Louisianan who identified as Creole, now all of a sudden you are racially suspect. As Anglo-Americans exert more political power, their assumption is that to be Creole is to be racially mixed. And so if you're a white Louisianan, now, you are physically in danger. Your whole family is in danger of losing their livelihood, their well-being, if you're not understood to be 100% pure white. And so under that kind of pressure, initially, many try to reclaim the word Creole and say to be Creole is to be pure white and pure European. Didn't work. So as we get into the late 19th century, early 20th century, more say, we're just gonna have to get rid of that. We're just gonna have to, we're not Creole, we're white. And it's a tragedy because you can't really claim the cultural identity you have. The language begins to die out. What you see over from the late 19th into the mid 20th centuries is that Creoles of color have an incentive to either pass as white or to really emphasize their Creole identity and distance themselves from Black Americans. Stay within their own communities to try to have some buffer around themselves and the racist craziness that's going on, right? I don't say that from any kind of judgment. I say that because it was literally an atmosphere of terror. People are trying to stay alive, right? And so it made sense to say, we're not quite with that group, like we're this other group over here. For white Louisianans, their incentive was to completely jettison a Creole identity, come all together and just become white. So it's a tragedy for both groups, right? So that's, it had a profound impact.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that answer, for that insight too. And I'm gonna check one more question here. Okay. Could you tell us more about your research on George Washington Cable and how it illustrates what you were saying about the political significance of some of the literary productions of the 19th century? good question. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, that's a really interesting one. So George Washington Cable was a writer from New Orleans, but he was an Anglo-American, all right? And his writing was, it was literary, but it was social criticism or social commentary that he did through fiction. So he had a very strong sense of social justice. He was very critical of the racism he saw all around him. And he was very critical of Creoles. He's very critical of them. And so he wrote this novel called The Grandissimes.
Mhm.
And it came out in serial. I believe it was in Scribner's. And so, the way that it used to work is every week, a new part of the story comes out. And so he wrote The Grandissimes serialized, and then it was bound together as a novel and free to the public in 1881. So what he does in Grandissimes is really quite amazing. Basically, it's this whole social commentary and critique of Louisiana Creoles, of white Louisiana Creoles in particular, calling them hypocrites, unjust, racist. How does he do that? He starts the novel off at a masquerade ball. And he does, at the masquerade ball, there's this confusion. Wait, who is that? Wait, who is behind that mask? And, it starts out with a sense of confusion and masking, literally. You get into the book and you see that the main character is Honoré de Grandissime. And I'm just telling you, as a reader myself, and I'm sorry for the spoiler alert here, but there's no way I can talk about this without the spoiler alert.
Right.
So you can cover your ears right now if you don't, or put me on mute if you don't want the spoiler alert. There you go. Okay, now, if you're still listening, so what happens is that there are two Honoré de Grandissimes. And so when I first read it, I was so confused. I was just so confused because for a good 1/3 of the book or so, and it's a pretty long book, nothing seemed to make any sense. I was like, but now he's what? And so finally it comes out that there are two of them, but he writes it as if there's just one Honoré de Grandissime. And it doesn't become clear. He has this American, kind of main character who's just as confused as you are, who's going through New Orleans and trying to figure out what the heck, who are these? What are they doing? And so Frauenfeld is the one who finally figures it out and clues all of us as readers into what's going on, that basically the two Honoré de Grandissime have the same white father, and one has a white mother and one has a mother of African descent. And so they are half brothers. Mm-hmm. And he, long story short, he does this to hammer home this point that he wants to make, that Creoles, many of them are racially mixed. They're hiding their racial mixture, but then persecuting people of color, which makes them the worst kinds of hypocrites. Mm-hmm. So the novel was a grand success across the country. People loved it. White Creoles did not love it. Mm. He was driven from the city in ignominy. They hated him. And they said, who is this man? We don't know him. He doesn't speak French. He hasn't been around us. How dare he? He doesn't know anything about us. So they did not like it at all. But in the rest of the country, it was very, very well received. And it really, I think, just made even firmer this idea that all Creoles are racially mixed and that white Creoles are just lying through their teeth. They're all racially mixed and just trying to cover it over. So it did not help at all. And it's unfortunate, because then white Creoles are pushed out of their Creole identification, assimilate into mainstream whiteness. Not all of them, but I would say the vast majority of them did that. And maybe they would retreat to their own family circles. And within their own circles, they would still recognize and acknowledge their Creole identity. But in the larger culture, they would not.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. And that's very interesting. I'm sure a lot of people are going to go get that book. Very interesting. One more question. Let's see. The point was raised that cultural and linguistic differences sometimes render impressions of Creole Louisiana as exotic. How do you think mass tourism has impacted that impression? I remember you talking about that a little earlier.
Yeah. I think it's just reinforced it. And I think that Louisiana is partner in this exoticization, because in its own exoticization, because it sells tickets, right? It sells tours, just to be economically crass about it. So I think, and I don't think that that's unique. I think in any kind of highly tourist dependent community, there's always going to be that tension between, okay, who are we really? But who do they want to see so that we can get their dollars? There's always that kind of tension between the face that is presented to the tourist and who we really know we are behind doors, right? And so people in Louisiana know who they are, but they put on the show for the people who are coming in. You have the voodoo shops in different places, the ghost tours, right? And it's a way of surviving. It is a way of surviving, but it still plays into this larger idea of the place as being exotic. Now, that said, I will say that there are unique differences. There is a real, true, unique cultural core in Louisiana, and particularly in New Orleans, that is really distinct. It's not, a kind of cynical selling of themselves. It really is unique. I would just say it's more complex and nuanced than what is often presented to tourists. So there really is something different about Louisiana, and especially about New Orleans, and it's beautiful. I would not want it to be changed for anything. So I guess I would just say that this idea of being exotic has been reinforced. And for those who are coming to Louisiana and who are coming to New Orleans, that they need to not let themselves get sucked into these kind of surface level stereotypes. They need to be able to find ways to kind of go into and experience the place for what it really is. Everyday people, everyday food, everyday experiences, and not just, give into the razzle dazzle of what the tour operators want to sell them.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think we're about out of time now, and I think that's a good way to end it. Louisiana's culture, unique, complex, nuanced, and still everyday.
That's right. That's right.
Families, working, playing, loving every day.
Every day.
Oh, I thank you so much for joining us today.
It was a pleasure, Tiffany. Thank you.
It was a pleasure to have you here. I know this is not the last meeting that we'll have.
Yes, well, and I look forward to seeing you when I am back in New Orleans, because I do miss it.